Today the question is simple. Good morning, by the way. Why do people hate and love PMCs? I've talked to quite a few people in trying to get a better understanding in order to frame this discussion that we're going to have, and we are going to have it. For those of you that are neutral, I need to explain really why there is such polarization on the issue, and there is huge polarization. Why some people absolutely despise private military companies with every fibre of their being, and why some people love them. So, the general population mostly ignores PMCs. They're not so knowledgeable on it, and that's probably to be expected. They know very little about PMCs. Most people don't actually know they exist at all. But for those that do know they exist, the majority of people I've talked to, at least those not involved in the defence industry itself, they hate the concept of the PMC. Generally, this doesn't come from a considered viewpoint. I don't think it's really justified. It's not really an argument so much against them, but it's derived from something within people, and that's really what I'm going to talk about today. It's a hatred that's completely visceral. So before actually looking at the considered version of this debate, looking whether they're ethical, whether they're legal, whether they're necessary, whether they're good, I think it's a good thing to look at what comes before, and that's the gut feeling that people get about this concept, the concept that private military firms can exist and can operate in conflicts around the world. So, as I've said, for a lot of people, the feeling they have is total hate. This hate, it's something that it's quite easy to explain. It might be correct, it might not be correct, but it certainly, in my view, isn't rational. And I think the way to frame it is by basically explaining it in a bit of an odd way, a bit of a roundabout way. So, just indulge me for a moment. It should be pretty simple. Think of films over the past 70 years. So if you're, 80, discount the first 10 years of your life. How many films can you think of that have a corporate villain? I can think of a load, just off the top of my head. Dick Jones from RoboCop, Burke from Aliens, The Wayland, Mr. Wayland from the Alien franchise, Noah Cross from Chinatown, Cochrane from Halloween 3, Henry F. Potter from It's a Wonderful Life. It really does go on. One could literally be here for hours explaining this sort of stuff. Gordon Gekko, another one. The commodity traders in Trading Places. Mr. Burns from The Simpsons. It's a trope within film, within TV, within media, and it extends to our culture. And there's a feeling of animosity, really, that is somewhat inherent towards these corporate villains. It's easy to create this hatred because, for the audience, largely it's already there. It's easy to portray these corporate villains, as it were, these corporate people as greedy, perhaps even psychopathic, disconnected. That's another one, Patrick Bateman. Uncaring, materialistic, megalomaniacal, even. So these people, they're seen as lacking tribal allegiance that's needed to create an integral society. It's power in uncertain hands. It's the potential for tyrannical power within a capitalist system. And that's just the sociological way of explaining it. That doesn't necessarily mean it's justified. People like the idea of the evil billionaire. And obviously there is, as I say, a lot of socio-biological factors that contribute to the idea of this corporate villain. Now, if you indulge me again, we've looked at the corporate villain. If you think about, again, the past 70-odd years of film, TV, anything, books even, how many villains are military men, as it were? We see a load of people. Colonel Kurtz from Apocalypse Now, Barnes from Platoon, that guy from Avatar, a number of the characters from Full Metal Jacket. There's a load of prominent anti-heroes. The gentleman who ordered the code red in A Few Good Men, the drill sergeant in An Officer and a Gentleman, And this is only in the traditional military sense. Just yesterday, I watched Captain Phillips again. And the villains in that film are Somali pirates, and they are villains because they're effectively a paramilitary organisation. They attack a boat with AK-47s. If we look to video games as well, in every single one of the Call of Duty games, the villain is a military man in some sense of the word. And they've actually pretty well been able to encapsulate a lot of, I guess, the expanse of this idea of the military villain. And so, largely, I think for the military villain, at least it's historical. What we've seen happen with military power when it gets into the wrong hands is really incredibly negative, of course. And that's why I haven't even begun to talk about the sort of characteristic villain on the other side of the conflict as a military man. You look at the guy who people are fighting against, Hans Lander, a real-life example, Amon Goeth. You really do see this sentiment derived from history, and that's something that's difficult to shake. That is something that gives people a visceral feeling when they encounter this sort of a concept. So these characters are sort of equally both the military villain, in any sense you want to look at it, and the corporate villain. They're pretty easy to portray, but the military villain as dangerous, ruthless, unyielding, unstoppable, cold, detached, again, megalomaniacal. They're relentless in purpose. They're detached from anything other than the orders that they care about above all, or they take the power of the military into their own hands for personal gain. And again, the power in the hands of these people, these fictional people generally, it's in the hands of people who believe in things that are not necessarily good for the nation, that aren't necessarily moral, that aren't something, I guess, supported by the average viewer, what the average viewer sees as good. And this is something particularly for the military villain, as well as the corporate villain to an extent, if you think that these tropes are actually largely within some of the most capitalist countries on the planet, within media. Both of these concepts are something that are well captured within the zeitgeist, the current zeitgeist, of all cultures around the world. And that makes it a very common thing, and that creates a lot of hatred towards PMCs, real visceral reaction. So, again, thanks for indulging me for a moment with that film thing. The conclusion we come to, or at least I come to, when we see a mix of, the corporation and the military as villains, and we see those sort of merge and people envision the PMC, it scares a lot of people, and people hate to be scared. They really vehemently dislike the idea that someone with, I guess, this sort of power is concerned with profit. And people perhaps don't even really think about the concept itself. They're instantly against it, without ever considering the full implication, without ever considering whether it's ethical, whether it's good, whether these people in themselves are good. So I think shouldn't necessarily just stop there. People associate this idea of villainy, I guess, that they already have concerning the military, concerning companies, corporations. And they sort of, it's already in films at the moment actually, in a lot of media, they merge it to create this idea of the evil arms dealer. And virtuous paramilitaries turned evil. It was only a couple of months ago that it was brought to my attention the game Call of Duty Advanced Warfare had exactly this characteristic villain played out. It has the main antagonist as a profit and power-hungry CEO of a PMC played by Kevin Spacey, and that really is it, the merging of the idea of people hungry for both power and profit, and they have a lot of it. There's this idea of the merging of villains we've grown up with booing on screen that's occurring. And I don't think this is the right way of necessarily looking at things. I'll be addressing this at a later date, but I certainly think we need to be far more, at least cognitive, in our consideration of the reality of PMCs, that they're not necessarily these characteristically evil organizations, that we can't just look at them as the sum of over-the-top villains we see on TV. So, as I say, it's not so cut and dry. We have to look at the realities of these organizations. So, in any case, I've talked to these people who really hate PMCs, and they gave me a pretty good list of pretty good list to go off, that really proves their opinion, as it were. And these are basically some things they gave me. So they said PMCs lack empathy, they lack consideration for the full implication of their actions. They are incentivized by war, the profit incentive of war, its positive association with the negative implications of war, association with others who may be blameworthy for the negative implications of war. They receive public expenditure sometimes. They have too much power, they're illegitimate, they're concerned with profit above all. Now, I talk to people who really have this hatred for PMCs, but I also talk to people who really absolutely love them. People who see things entirely the other way, people who perhaps were more in touch with the military reality. And I'll share what a lot of these people, both those who hate it and those who love it, shared with me in regard to their cognitive arguments for it, beyond this gut feeling. So, a lot of people, as I say, really love the private military corporation. They told me stories of how PMCs had been the only help they'd had, that security contractors put themselves in danger to save the lives of men in the military, sometimes and a lot of the time, in situations when they didn't necessarily have to. One man said that without the aid of a PMC, he'd pretty much certainly be dead. There are people who feel really the opposite of hatred, love, in fact. People who say that PMCs saved their nation from total implosion, created order, that without the PMC, national militaries couldn't function, that they're necessary, and that, actually those in the military can get on with more important jobs, that they don't have to deal with those tasks that are a pain but necessary, defending officials, defending areas of land, for example, all sorts really. A lot of people I talked to said PMCs also aren't really truly profit-driven. If you look at a lot of PMCs, they don't start out as PMCs, they start out as means by which to train operators. In some cases, they start out as organizations which look to benefit socioeconomically, purely certain areas of conflict that use a PMC as a tool. So, some people were saying they saw them doing things they weren't paid for the good of the campaign. The firm allowed military people to use certain facilities that were only brought in by the PMCs due to the capital backing they had, that they were really part of the strength of certain military campaigns, that they were vital, in fact, and actually a real benefit to the military operating alongside them. In addition, a number of people claimed that it meant those people who were high-skilled soldiers, operators, good friends of theirs, could continue working in order to aid areas of conflict. That even as they got perhaps slightly older, they had to, let's say, move out of military organizations because their priorities changed. They had to prioritize money, they had a family to take care of, they had to be at home more. The PMC facilitated them to do both and still fight for the benefit of their national values. And basically, the campaign gets to retain the best trained men fighting for national efforts, even if technically at a higher price. So I think it's a really interesting concept. People have a really, really visceral reaction to this in both directions. And I'll have to address this beyond the visceral at some point soon, but I think at least for today, it's worth looking at why people are so divided, so polarized, why some people absolutely hate them, and why some people absolutely love them. So I'm going to leave it there. But again, this is not the end. We'll talk more soon.